Hey, it's Jessica DeMassa with WTF Health. What's the future of health? I am talking to the who's who of health tech and healthcare innovation. And today we're going to have a really exciting conversation about kind of the future of mental health when it comes to pharmaceuticals. So please join me in welcoming Kabir Nath. He is the Senior Managing Director for Otsuka, which is Otsuka is how it's pronounced, Pharmaceuticals. It's a pleasure to have you here, Kabir.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, Jessica, for the invitation.
Well, past that first surprise of learning that Atsuka is really pronounced Otsuka, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of excitement here to talk about. I really love the approach that you are taking in terms of the way that you're looking at building out a formulary for mental health, and I think it really shows the potential for innovation in the future. And so, my love for digital therapeutics. I'm also very excited by the psychedelic space, and you're involved in both. So I'm wondering if you could maybe high level for us, to tell us about the vision for the future as you see it when it comes to the treatment for mental health. I mean, what is this formulary that you're building, and how do those different types of new alternative psychedelic medicines fit in with DTX, fit in with traditional therapeutics, fit in with everything else that's available?
No, thank you, Jessica, and it's a really good question. So first, everything with us starts with the patient. We start with our patient promise that patients are people first. And what we know is that despite some significant advances in pharmacological things, in drugs like the ones that we have developed and commercialized over the years, still we are failing people with serious mental illness. Many people are not getting to good outcomes, and therefore, despite the fact that we are a pharmaceutical company at its core, we have for a long time been very focused on how can we bring broader solutions to people living with serious mental illness. We're humble enough to recognize that the pill or the injection we make is only one part of the patient's journey. There are a host of other factors and so on as well. So over the years, as we thought about this, what that led us to? First, it is essential to continue to look for, to research new modalities. So we must continue to look for new mechanisms of action. We signed a venture collaboration with Sanovian last year, a global collaboration for co-development and co-commercialization, which has the potential to bring forward a truly novel, differentiated mechanism for treatment. We see, for instance, psychedelics, again, as potentially a very novel, highly differentiated mechanism that may really help for people, particularly with some very serious conditions like treatment-resistant depression, areas where we have no treatments today, like anorexia, or areas like OCD and so on. I think we're very early in that journey. There are, as you know, an explosion of companies active in that space, but we saw that as, again, taking us where the science is taking us. This science is very interesting, a whole host of challenges with how we get that to patients, but something that we believed we had to put our foot into that. More broadly on the digital side, one of the challenges with traditional psychiatry also is, unfortunately, it's about as far from precision medicine as you can get. Unfortunately, we don't have today physiological or biological or genetic biomarkers that allow us to say that one particular treatment will work for a given patient or not. And as you're aware, it's essentially a process of experimentation until we're lucky enough maybe to find a drug that works for someone. Because we're so far away, unfortunately, despite billions of dollars of effort from those physiological or genetic biomarkers, we've also long believed that the intersection of technology with psychiatry may enable us to move to something that's more tailored to get to richer patient segmentation and so on. Specifically, we know that there are millions of apps out there that purport to, offer mindfulness, to improve certain symptoms and so on. But when we actually studied it, we came to the conclusion that in the field of behavioral health, it really is potentially possible to have apps, if appropriately designed with patients in mind, with the right thought around patient engagement, to have apps that could actually truly ameliorate certain symptoms of serious mental illness. And so made the decision a number of years ago that this was an area we wanted to get into, recognizing again, it's very challenging, it's a very different paradigm. So our hope is that in the years to come, patients will have the opportunity to access a much broader set of therapies broadly defined, which could be digital as monotherapy, it could be digital as adjunct to traditional drugs, it could be traditional drugs, or it could in future be psychedelics, knowing that they too are going to need to come with psychological support, with other digital tools to be effective. So it's still the early days of that promise, But as people, as a company that is committed to this area and committed to being leaders in this area, we truly believe that we have to operate across that spectrum for all the difficulties and challenges that brings.
No, and I think that's wonderful. And I think, building this treatment, this array of treatment modalities that can address mental health conditions in such diverse ways, it really, it puts a lot of arrows in everyone's quiver here. I'm curious on the patient side, what kind of feedback you've been receiving, or what you're hearing, as you're looking at the sum total of all that you're building here, how receptive are patients, to some of these more novel treatments, or, the combination of a DTX plus a traditional drug. I mean, what is the sentiment that you're gaining from patients, if you were to just generalize?
Yeah. So I mean, so what we know is, when you actually ask patients, I mean, many of them are very open to virtual care, shall we say, and certainly there is a strong sense that finding options just to the face-to-face interaction between a provider and a patient gives the patient more choice in their treatment, and that many patients are comfortable with that. We've seen that just with telemedicine, but we also know that increasingly, and particularly, as generations shift, young patients in particular, are comfortable with the virtual side, with interacting on their phones or other devices and so on. So, broadly put, I think there is acceptance. Specifically, when you ask in the field of mental health, there's also significant acceptance. And in fact, for some people, it's a way to deal with the stigma, to avoid some of the stigma that unfortunately is still associated with treatment for serious mental illness. All that said, we also fully understand that human interaction is absolutely key, particularly for serious mental illness, which is not just a chemical or biological issue, has social, environmental, a whole host of other factors, past trauma and so on. So we don't believe that technology in any way is going to substitute for that either, but it can be an adjunct.
On the provider side, talk to me about how receptive they are to getting these new modalities, because I mean, this is the thing we always hear on the health technology side of things, is you need to focus on winning over the clinician. And so I would imagine that this is no different in this particular area of medicine, like you just said, very sensitive. So I mean, talk to me about the clinician side of adoption, as far as receptivity to digital therapeutics or receptivity to psychedelics from your standpoint. I mean, it's coming from a different place than a startup when it comes with the backing of a global pharmaceutical company.
Well, so first, let me stress again, it's still very early days. Yes, I mean, our core focus remains on our traditional pharmaceutical products. But I think what we are trying to do is clearly build alliances with providers to provide better outcomes for patients. So the first lens is always that patient. So for us, where we've started with digital therapeutics is going through a traditional clinical trial to demonstrate efficacy. And for us, that's really critical. Similarly, where we are working with other companies or have invested in other companies in psychedelics, it's again going down a traditional route of building clinical evidence in the time-honored way to show that these things work. So we see that as fundamentally important for, as a starting place. We obviously have to do that in order to persuade clinicians that these things are of value to patients, and that's a key starting point. But I think also, again, we know that psychiatrists in particular were very comfortable with telehealth, with telemedicine, so they've accepted that that can play a significant role. And we see an openness to experimenting with other modalities. I will say, obviously, as well as clinicians, we will need to persuade. And that's where, again, we are still at the very, very early days of generating the evidence on sufficient scale that demonstrates that these things actually bring value to the health system as well. But that clearly is another key challenge that we've got to undertake.
I want to go back to the clinical trial that you referenced. So is this the clinical trial that you're doing with Click Therapeutics in major depressive disorder? Talk to me a little bit about how that's going, because I understand, I mean, like when I spoke with you at the Vive event a few months ago or a few weeks ago, it had just kicked off more or less. So where are we? And then I'd love broadly to hear your thoughts on what a trial like this means, because what was impressive to me about it was not the partnership necessarily between Otsuka and Click, but the fact that it was the first fully remote clinical trial ever to be done for major depressive disorder. So I think that this sets a precedent about what can be done in the future. But I'd love to hear, what you think the significance is of this trial, as well as, what happened. How's it going? Do we have results yet?
So sadly, we don't have results yet, but hold this space.
Okay.
Late this year or early next year, we should get the results of that. So yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, first, this is a digital therapeutic as an adjunct to antidepressants, number one. But number two, as you say, it is the first fully remote trial in major depressive disorder, working with our collaborative partner, Click, but also working with Verily. So we were one of the original partners in the Verily baseline project, one of the first 4 pharma companies. And so this is being done with them. What's the power of this? Clearly, there are, we hope, some efficiencies, both in terms of speed and cost through this. But most importantly, this is one of the ways we see as potentially to access a much more diverse and representative group of patients. I think everyone is aware, and I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast is aware, that we have a significant problem of representation in the clinical trial setting. Historically, across whatever therapeutic areas, we have not traditionally involved appropriately representative, appropriately diverse populations. We see, excuse me, headphones slipping there. We see this fully virtual trial as one key tool, one key opportunity to access a much broader pool of patients. And we're excited. We're excited that we've done it. It is underway. It's been operationalized very effectively. And yes, we will be very excited, as everyone else, to see the results later this year or early next year.
No, I know. I think we're all very eager to see now, especially some of these larger scale rollouts or these more clinically valid testing of DTX, because I think it's been a while, as that industry has started to gain a foothold in healthcare space. I think it's looking at it with more traditional ways of proving out these modalities has been, I think, something that we've been eagerly anticipating. So it'll be exciting to see what happens there. I'm curious too on, I have to go back to the psychedelic side of things as well, Kabir, and just hear what your thoughts are on that category of treatment options. Because, so you guys have invested in Mindset, which is psilocybin, but like you said, it's early days. And there are a lot of startups out there that are not just doing psilocybin, but also working with things like ketamine or, working with others, so what do you think about that category? And like, from your perspective, obviously you've put your money where your mouth is, and in some way you see some validity there, right? But like long term, what do you think how do you think this is going to pan out? And how far are we from this becoming like a real mainstream, like, oh yeah, we could just do this kind of treatment option when it comes to mental health?
No, well, thank you. So yeah, so our first foray was actually an investment into Compass Pathways, which is studying psilocybin, and they are probably among the most advanced companies. They reported their phase 2B last year for psilocybin. As I said earlier, it behooves us as a company that wants to be leaders in mental health to follow the science. And what we had emerged in the last few years after that kind of 30, 40-year lull of very little work, what emerged in the last few years was some extremely impressive evidence, but really with some very small ends, some very small numbers around that. And again, in the spirit of believing that we need to actually demonstrate in significant numbers the opportunity here, that's why we invested, for instance, in Compass Pathways. Through our McQuaid Center for Strategic Research and Development, which is an affiliate, a fully owned part of Otsuka in the US, we have, as you said, started to work with Mindset. That's very, very early, and there we are funding them in the very early stages. And what we bring there is the fact that we clearly have significant experience in this area in clinical development and so on. I think let's acknowledge that bringing any of these products to patients at scale is still faces a formidable set of challenges, regulatory, structural. How do you provide the psychological support at scale? What form of digital platforms and so on are going to be needed? And, there are going to be challenges around IP and around a whole range of things and so on as well. But if we always start from the patient and say that we fundamentally believe there are significant numbers of patients who could benefit from some of these therapies in the right setting, appropriately distributed and so on, then, we will, along with many other pioneers in this space, ultimately find solutions that deliver exactly that. Now, is that 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years away? I think that depends who you talk to in the space. But I would hope that it's, for the first opportunities, it's very much at the shorter end of that spectrum.
Oh, okay. I love that you're like, it depends who you talk to. I'm like, okay, senior managing director at Otsuka. Well, what do you think? This is why I'm talking to you.
No, so look, again, I think we will see compelling clinical evidence emerge within the next 2 or 3 years. So I think we will start to see, much larger ends in terms of patient studies. I think we'll see compelling evidence. I think, that will dispel some of the hype, but actually really
Yeah.
show us which patients can benefit from this. What's harder to predict is, as I say, those challenges of delivery in a commercially viable paradigm, given everything else that's needed to make this a successful outcome for the patient. And that one's harder for me to understand, but I think, will we see compelling clinical evidence that helps to move the field forward significantly? I think we will see that within 3 years.
It's just exciting to see your thinking on this. 3 years, that would be amazing. Okay, last thing I want to ask you about is some of the behind the scenes stuff, some of the behind the scenes health tech. So we've got, I cover the space broadly. And so one of the
Right.
things that I'm fascinated in is, real world evidence, real world data. You mentioned Verily. I mean, so there are a lot of tech partners that are working with you behind the scenes in terms of helping, make those clinical trials more diverse or executing them more efficiently, data collection, drug development, things like that. Can you give us a sense of how some of that is going, and how you're looking at improving the core business process of drug development by using some of these new technologies, and what you see as the real opportunity moving forward as far as those are concerned?
No, thanks, Jessica. That's a great question. So one thing I should even have said about digital therapeutics earlier, clearly, part of the promise there is the amount of data that you can collect through digital therapeutics, and the fact that ultimately, whether companies like us are selling individual digital therapeutics, or whether we're actually able to access data at a population level that helps health systems and so on. I think that's one of the interesting questions around that whole space. But more broadly, yes, I mean, with the explosion of data and analytics capability, you're starting to see, even in areas like psychiatry, real world evidence become much more important in a way it has been in other therapeutic areas. So we're working with Hallmusk, for instance, we have a collaboration with them in terms of seeing how some of the real world evidence, some of the data we have around our medicines used actually by patients, can help to inform better choices in future. Again, if you start from the premise I started with, which is we have great drugs, but we don't know who they work for or why they work for certain people and so on, the only way you're actually going to get to answers on that is by looking at the big data sets that we do now increasingly have available to us to do that. I think the other side of the business, and we talked about the fully remote trial, but of course, even before that, we, like everyone else, had been investing in appropriate platforms so that we could actually get real-time monitoring of clinical trials and so on. So we invested in a host of tools, and I think you will again obviously continue to see technology be leveraged, in a number of different pockets by pharmaceutical companies, whether it's, as I say, on the development side or indeed on the commercial side in terms of omnichannel and so on and so forth. But the real promise of digital health and delivering superior outcomes to patients, as I said, I think we are truly only at the very, very starting point of that in this industry.
Kabir, I'm excited to talk to you. I'm excited to hear of all the different ways that you have integrated, innovations and new technology into the business over there. And we will definitely have to check back with you to hear how things are going. But thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me specifically about the way this is playing out in the sphere of mental health, because I do think that that is so important, especially right now. And just having this opportunity to just discuss this with you and hear a little bit about the strategy behind all of this is just exciting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, we will talk to you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Kabir Nath from Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. Please check out more interviews with the who's who of health tech as they are changing the way that we do healthcare over on my YouTube channel. It is youtube.com/WTF Health. Again, a big thanks to Kabir. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.